On my immediate right, I'm pleased to introduce Tessa Ransford, who's a very well-known, very loved poet of Edinburgh. Tessa was instrumental in the foundation of the Scottish Poetry Library and also has been actively involved for many years in the activities of International PEN Scotland as well. And Tessa's just had a new book published called Made in Scotland, which is photographs and poems about Arthur's Seat. On my immediate left, I'm pleased also to introduce Maria Fyfe. Maria may be a familiar figure to you from television screens. Maria sat as MP for Glasgow Maryhill from 1987 up to 2001. She can claim in some ways to be the midwife of the Scottish Parliament, given that Donald Dewar claimed the paternity. And in acting as midwife, Maria ensured that there was strong representation of women MSPs in the Parliament. Maria has taken her experience at Westminster and has distilled it into a new book, A Problem Like Maria. And like Tessa's books, it's published in Edinburgh by Lewis Press. On my far right, can I introduce Andrew Scott? Andrew Ferguson, apologies. Andrew is in exile, living at the moment in Surrey, but he has written a book on the Scots who enlightened the world, looking at the major figures of the Scottish Enlightenment. Andrew is much in demand as a speaker, and we're pleased to have him here for the historical and indeed contemporary perspective he can bring. And finally, last but not least, of course, I have Craig Smith, or do you prefer Craig A. Smith?
Drop the A.
Drop the A, Craig Smith. Craig is author of The Mile, which is set a week before this September's referendum, and covers the
real one's bigger than that.
Covers the rambunctious journey of a nationalist, a unionist, and a couldn't care lesser on their way down the Royal Mile, arriving at the bottom of the Royal Mile to some conclusion or no conclusion. You'll have to read the book to find out. Craig is a man of Musselburgh as opposed to Edinburgh, and so he'll bring us a foreign perspective possibly on tonight's topic. The format is relatively simple. I'm going to invite each of the panel to speak for 3 minutes or so, giving their point of view. I'll then come back to them each in turn for a minute or so that they can respond to what the others have said, and then I'll open up the floor to you for questions. And I hope you've got fairly incisive questions to keep them all on their toes. But we'll start with Tessa, and Tessa, would you like to give us, as it were, your perspective upon independence?
Well, yes, thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you everybody for coming along tonight, and to the Central Library for inviting me. Is the microphone working? Are you hearing me all right? Good. Okay. I'll try to speak without hesitation or deviation. But if I do, I've got my notes here on a piece of pink paper. So I'm pleased to be here, not least because I have dedicated most of my life to Scottish poetry in various ways, in the context of Scottish literature, in the context of Scottish culture, from the standpoint of Scotland. And the standpoint is important because it determines what we see. So my standpoint is Scotland, my centre is Scotland. Scotland is my home. Now, literature has no boundaries. That's one of our slogans in International PEN, for which I was president for a few years. It has no boundaries, but it has a home. And that home is very important, and my definition of a Scottish writer is a writer who considers Scotland their home. I consider Scotland my home. That home informs our lives, and it informs our work as writers. And reciprocally, writers help to make the place that they call home more real. They realise it. The writer Ian Crichton Smith, who died in 1998, he wrote in Gaelic and English poems, plays, and novels. he also published a 60-page essay entitled Real People in a Real Place. It took him 60 pages to explore that relationship. And Patrick Geddes has famously always emphasized the right relationship that's necessary between folk, work, and place. Now, literature has been around in Scotland for hundreds of years, in written and oral form, in many languages and dialects. Much of it has been lost through the vicissitudes of history, and much of it has been lost through neglect and ignorance. I'll come back to that. But literature is important for people, and it's important for our people, because it expresses the inner life, what we might call the interior landscape. Some might call it the inscape, or the individuation, or the quiddity, that which makes us, saves us, I would say, from being hollow people, from being one-dimensional people. In fact, the lack of discussion about culture in the run-up to the referendum, I think, has made us seem rather one-dimensional, as if economics is all that matters to us. So literature expresses that inner life of a people or of a person. But literature in Scotland is also something we're rather good at. In the 18th century, the French called us a nation of poets and philosophers. I wish that was still the case and it wasn't that we were a nation of festivals and fireworks. But anyway, that's what they called us in the 18th century, and I'm sure Andrew will know more about that than I do. But it was a Frenchman called Buckle. But Hugh MacDiarmid wrote an essay in the 1950s entitled Aesthetics in Scotland, where he claimed that literature is for us in the same sort of relation as, say, ballet is to Russia or opera to Italy. In other words, it's something we're quite good at, and we also rather take for granted that people can do. But literature, like any other living creature, needs the right environment. The right environment is something, as humans, we can create. And that's what I tried to do in the Scottish Poetry Library. I tried to create a better environment for poetry in Scotland. Any nation, for its literature, needs shops, bookshops, libraries, and well-funded publishers. And those publishers in Scotland also need to take on the responsibility for publishing translation. Translation, which I call internal, between the many languages used within Scotland by our writers, past and present, and that's ever-changing. I was involved in a book with a Palestinian writing in Arabic, published by Luath last year, but also translation internationally. But apart from shops and publishers and libraries, we also need a nourishing and encouraging environment through our education system. We need an education system that, as a matter of course, runs courses in Scottish literature. We need academics to do the necessary research to overcome the years of neglect and ignorance, and also to do the critical reviewing and the PhD studying and the background work in bibliographies and biographies, all that underpins and sustains and makes substantial a literature. We need that, and we don't need academics who think it's insignificant and unimportant and don't encourage their students to study Scottish literature, which has been the case for many years. But apart from an education system that supports our literature, we also need a media that supports our literature. And that media should also, as a matter of course, run programs on our literature. Finally, I'd like to say that I consider literature vitally important for two reasons. It gives us ideas, and ideas give us mental energy. And it gives us ideals, and ideals give us emotional energy. And when emotional energy and mental energy come together, we get that thing called human energy. And human energy can take responsibility for itself, can make decisions, and can decide its own destiny. And I hope that when it comes to September the 18th, we'll have what Robert Burns called the pith sense and pride of worth, to appreciate our own literature and to vote yes.
And over to Maria.
Right, thank you. And can I add my own thanks to all concerned with organising tonight's event and for all of you for coming along too. When I was composing my thoughts for tonight's short speech, I thought, I know practically nothing about the problems of writers because I've only written one book and it's only newly been published. But I did think there are problems that everyone has in common, whether they are writers or not, and that are things to do with the way we'll make a decision on September the 18th. So I thought, I'll jot down some thoughts about the things that bother me, the things that are on my mind, and see if I can relate them to literature at large. Because I do think, for one thing, that while certainly Scottish literature ought to be promoted strongly, but we also ought to be able to have access to the good writing that comes from the rest of the United Kingdom and from the world at large, of course. So let me begin then. My grandchildren live in England, and the 10-year-old has said to me, well, will Scotland be a foreign country? And he got two answers to that. You know, one parent said, well, of course, they're breaking away, so that makes them foreign. And the other one was saying, but we're still neighbours, you know, it's not as if you're really, really foreign. But I want to keep my British passport. I'm proud to be British and proud to be Scottish. If there was time, I could go into detail about what makes me proud about Britain and Scotland. But in my own case, it has nothing to do with singing Land of Hope and Glory. My pride in Britain has to do much more with the development of the labour and trade union movement over the many years that it has, and how ordinary people could come together throughout these isles and make the case for all sorts of rights that had to be fought for. I feel I've got more in common with a Liverpudlian or a Mancunian than with a clan chief sitting in the House of Lords. And I think I can very briefly take the time to tell you a short story here, because it illustrates the point. Many years ago in Westminster, I was on the embryology bill, and the clan chiefs in the House of Lords, who had never in all the years I had been in the House of Commons raised a single thing to do with anything. They just kept quiet. And then what they did, they came in to move an amendment that a child who was born as a result of artificial dissemination by a donor should not be allowed to inherit the clan title and sit in the House of Lords. Now this was dismissed very well, particularly by an MP on that committee, who pointed out that DNA science had shown that quite a number of fathers of children were not actually the real father. You know? So therefore there were already quite a few guys in the House of Lords that shouldn't have been in there. I worry about the fracturing of the trade union movement, because over time, two separate countries will develop separate laws. But when you turn to literature, I think of Robert Tressel's The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist. Now that is if you've never read it, I beg you to read it. It's known as the Painter's Bible because this novel is about guys working in ordinary manual workers, and they're working in painting and decorating a house. And it's how they exchange their views of what goes on in the world and what they can do about it. Great stuff. It's the Labour MP's Bible as well, I think. I've never said that Scotland could not go it alone, but there's little discernible benefit, you know, for all the upheaval that would be caused. And I think I have come across sometimes a point of view that puts Scotland in a place where it's as if we were a colony. Well, I think that's nonsense. Scotland has never been a colony of England. It was a partner ever since the days of when, after 1707, and as it worked, nobody could have told it then, they didn't have crystal balls, But then the Industrial Revolution happened, and we were fully partners in all that went on then. So you think how that widened literacy among people. You began to have newspapers that were widely read with large circulations. Now, some of them are rubbish, okay, admittedly, but the point I'm making is that ability to inform people and have newspapers of varying quality was something that didn't exist before 1700 and something. So, one last point to make. We're told that if the no vote wins, nothing will change. Well, the reason we have a Scottish Parliament is that people were willing to have change. When John Smith was alive, he always called it the settled will of the Scottish people. And I think that was right. So much has changed in 300 years, you would not believe. I mean, if you talk of the early 18th century, they were still burning witches there at the stake because, if mad old women were considered a danger to society, and that's the kind of thing. So think of the huge change that has come our way over that 300 years. How much different will it be in another 300 years? But if we feel we've made a mistake when we make that decision, it's not like going back. It's not like a general election when you get rid of them and toss them out and get somebody else elected. You're stuck with a decision that you might not like. I'll conclude on that, thank you.
Andrew, your opening statement.
Right, thank you very much indeed. It's nice to see you all. As has been said by Alistair, I actually live down south, and therefore I don't have a vote, which makes my decision very easy. I am on neither side. What I did do, about 4 or 5 years ago, I started reading really originally about the Enlightenment and Enlightened figures, because it's something which I'd been told a lot about by my father when I was a young boy, and I wanted the stories to carry on. And about a year ago, we published a book which is called Scots Who Enlightened the World. And briefly, I want to sort of take an enlightened view today, but I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a background to the Enlightenment, because I'm sure you're going to know all about this, but it is quite interesting. The Enlightenment took place in Scotland. First of all, I'm going to give you a quotation. "It is a principle innate and co-natural to every man to have an insatiable inclination to truth and to seek for it as for hid treasure." Does anybody know who said that? That's very disappointing with an Edinburgh audience. Normally people say David Hume, actually, I have to say. It was a young boy called Thomas Aikenhead.
Oh, yeah,
and it was about 1679 or thereabouts. And it was August, I think. It was apparently a pretty rough day. And he'd come out of an ale house with his friends. And he'd said, "I wish I was in that place they call hell so I could warm myself there." And he was reported to the religious authorities. And in fact, the decision as to whether he should really probably have been told to misbehave, behave himself, to go to jail for a period of time and sort himself out. But in fact, the religious authorities, and then in those days it was a very strong Calvinist society, they wanted to make an example of him, and his case went to court. And in fact, it was an equal vote, and the casting vote was given by the Lord Chancellor, who actually said he should hang. And so this boy, who really had only made a few poor jokes about hell being a warm place and about Jesus learning his miracles from the stories of Egypt. He was really a silly young lad, and many people have said equally stupid things when they're students, particularly when they come out of an alehouse. He actually was hung. The last person in Britain to be hung for blasphemy. And that was 20 or 30 years before the Scottish Enlightenment. And just to give you the feel on the religious side, for example, it was therefore only 30, 40 years later, David Hume was saying that he couldn't see no reason to prove the existence of a god. And Aikenhead really got hung for far less. It was a country which was very much on the fringe of Europe. It was a very poor country. We'd had this famous Darien expedition where the ships had gone off to this idyllic place in Panama. You remember the story was we were going to have a colony on the Isthmus of Panama, which was going to act as a land bridge between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And this was going to bring immense wealth to the Scottish people. Unfortunately, the gentleman who put forward the scheme, a gentleman called William Patterson, who actually was quite important. He did many things. He was one of the founding directors of the Bank of England, one of the founding directors of the Bank of Scotland. Anyway, he painted this lovely picture of this idyllic country with sandy beaches and fertile lands and this warm, sunny climate. There's only one problem: he'd never been there. And in fact, it rained for 4 or 5 months of every year, and fever was endemic. And perhaps the worst thing of all was the land was claimed by the Spanish. So in fact, Scotland lost, they say, a third or a quarter of its wealth in that one expedition. We talked about the Calvinism. There was also, of course, the Act of Union, which was really brought about because Scotland had, by this stage, had very few choices, I think, because apart from having lost so much money in the Darien venture, there'd also been a period of very poor harvests, there was a lot of poverty, a lot of people were dying in the countryside through lack of food. So you had a country which has lost its independence, its parliament, it had lost its money, it had a very Calvinist tradition, and yet that's where you had this outpouring of new thinking. And I think it's quite remarkable, and I think it's an amazing tribute to Scotland and to Edinburgh, if I can say that tonight. And it was partly, I think, due to a number of factors, one of which I'm certain is very key, was education. I think people were very well educated in Scotland. There'd been a history in Scotland of social education. John Knox, I think, right back in years before, had put in an act demanding that every parish should have a school and a schoolmaster. The Bible was being read. They say that in the time of the Enlightenment, Scotland was the most literate country in Europe. It was also a country which was relatively small, so I think we had this lovely situation where these various philosophers could meet each other and exchange their views over a bottle or two of claret and sort their ideas out and how the world was going to run. So it is quite amazing that I think Enlightenment took place here, and I think it's a tremendous tribute to the people. In my book, I trace the stories of the Enlightenment through the lives of some of the people, rather than through the ideas. And also because two things I try and distill out of it. One is, are the lessons to be learned? And the other, of course, one has to deal with slightly, is the question of a referendum. How would the Enlightened people thought about the referendum? It's obviously quite an interesting question, really, because obviously in their case it had gone totally the other way around. It had now become part of England. Many Scots, like Hume, for example, originally, embraced the Act of Union and became North British. Although I don't think there's much record of English people describing themselves as South British, but there we are. But there was also, of course, initially quite a lot of hardship. But then eventually Scotland began to prosper, so it began to get prosperity and began to get the interplay of ideas. But the whole philosophy of the Enlightenment was based on rational decisions, based on facts. You know, I mean, that really encapsulates what it was all about. And I think what disappoints me as an observer of the referendum debate, an interested but non-voting observer, is that it seems to me that the two sides don't even seem to agree on the facts half the time, which is frustrating. And also, I also think it's a very negative debate. I mean, I think both sides should be trying to make a positive case, either for independence or to keep the Union. But I think again, from my observation, and you probably are far more aware of all the details than I am, it seems to me that too much of it is a negative argument. You know, they can't do this, they can't do this, they can't do something else. And it seems to me such a pity that that is the way it's been handled. I was just going to sort of end, if I can just find my quote, because I shall forget it otherwise as I get older. The Marquis of Montrose: he either fears his fate too much, or his deserts are small, that dare not put it to the touch, to win or lose it all. It seems to me that if you want independence, then you've got to believe in it, and it's not a question of whether you're going to be £500 better off or £300 worse off. I want to be independent. If you believe the union is the right thing, you should want the union because you think that is the right thing. And I think the sadness is there is not enough belief. There's too much, if you might say, bean counting and negative argument. And that's my personal opinion as an outsider.
Thank you. And over to Craig.
Thank you. I'd just like to echo everybody else's thanks for coming, thanks to the library for putting it on, thanks for giving me a seat on such an illustrious panel of proper writers. It's only, well, like Maria, I've only written one book. It's only very recently that I could call myself a writer. This time last year I was only halfway through the book, so it's all still quite new to me. Similarly, it's only recently that I made my mind up about independence. So to ask me as a writer why I hold my views on independence, it's quite a tricky one to answer, because it's actually my views on independence that led to me becoming a writer. So a bit of a chicken and an egg thing. My book, The Mile, features three characters who represent all sides of the debate. We've got a yes voter, a no voter, and an undecided voter, which was quite easy to do because at one point I've shared all those views. I've made my mind up now. I'd never have said I was pro-union, but then I was never particularly pro-independence either. I guess I probably started with a couldn't care less attitude, like a lot of people, like the character Stuart holds in the book. It was only after the SNP's majority in 2011 that I realised I was going to have to take a side here. So I probably started with the same default setting that I think a lot of people start, which is, well, I'm a no voter, that's the way it is. What's the point? Could we afford it? We probably couldn't afford it. It's not worth the effort. Like a lot of people, I was suffering from what's known as the Scottish cringe. I've been a Labour voter all my life. I voted for Maria's Labour Party. That was the party that believed in social justice for all. And when Tony Blair was elected after 18 years of Tory rule, it did seem like a new beginning. As it turned out, it wasn't a new beginning, it was actually the beginning of the end for me. 2003, we were led into the Iraq War, and I know Maria was as vocally opposed to it as I was, and thousands of others as we marched in Glasgow against it. But Labour went ahead with it anyway, and I thought, well, wait a minute, is this the Labour Party I've been voting for all these years? They're not representing the people. It was, marches across the world against that war. I thought they're not speaking for us anymore, but with no alternative, I kept voting for them. I voted for them again in 2005 and again in 2010 for all the good that did. And after a year of the current coalition government and the SNP landslide at Holyrood, it dawned on me that this constant revolving door of Labour, Tory, Tory, Labour, Tory, Lib Dem at Westminster wasn't working, and it never could. One lot get in and they blame the appalling legacy that they've inherited from the previous lot so they can reshape the economy to suit their agenda and vice versa. And we can't say, but Labour will get in and maybe everything will be fine again, but to quote the late Bob Crow, he said it was impossible to slip a fag paper between their policies now. So if Labour get in again, what's going to happen? 5 years, 10 years time, Tories get in again, and we start again. So it goes. Nothing changes. So I started looking at the alternative, and it doesn't take a lot of research to discover that the subsidy junkie stories were pretty much rubbish. We pay in a lot more than we get back. The more you start digging, the more the scare stories start to crumble. And when you've got the politicians behind Better Together, whose jobs rely on a remote seat of government, telling you to vote no to retain that remote seat of government, it's not hard to see where the real motives lie. That's when I realised that only a yes vote could deliver true full democracy to Scotland, so we could have accountable politicians elected by us, the people of Scotland, to represent our interests. My experience, my journey from no to yes, gave me enough material to write the book, and I hope my book will encourage others to maybe start at least asking questions. I'm not expecting it to convert anybody, but if it makes people start questioning things, then that's not a bad thing. Maybe they'll be able to shake off the Scottish cringe that I suffered from as well, because it's a huge weight off your shoulders, believe me. I think Scotland can be a successful independent nation, nobody's denying that, and we can, should, must vote yes in September so we can protect the things we hold dear in this country, such as our protected NHS, free education, and by removing Trident and showing Westminster how a democratic parliament really works, we can start having a progressive and positive influence on the world and the rest of the UK. That's it. Thank you.
Now, originally I was going to go around all our 4 speakers again, but they've each set out their stall extremely eloquently and extremely clearly. So what I'm going to do is, as it were, skip that stage and go directly to you and offer now the floor to you. We have a roving microphone, so if you could put your hand up, then we'll be able to get the microphone to you.
Mr. Ferguson made the point that the debate has been rather turgid and lacking in bigger concepts, and it's been dragged down to the level of the bean counters. And that is depressingly true, but I'm afraid what we've had to put up with up here is a media and press which is dictating that, and which has their own agenda, and which is not prepared. And your question is? Yeah, I'd just like to make the point that is why you may see that the situation is like that. But outer in the greater debate, in meetings like this, people of all political persuasions are coming together and making a much more positive case. Maria Fyfe, I would just like to ask how it is that the Labour Party seems to be unique in not having any dissent on the future of this country, whereas, you know, there was within that party so much dissent on Trident, for example, way back when. How have you all managed to come together and sing with this one voice on all these issues which affect Scotland, and make it seem, am I unfair in suggesting that you are all looking after your own place on the gravy train?
Yes, and you can.
Well, for a start, it's simply not true that every single Labour Party member supports a no vote. There are some, there's not very many, it's a small percentage. Sorry, I tried to throw it. It's a small percentage, but there are members of the Labour Party who are planning to vote yes. So there isn't that unanimity across the whole membership. They would never have had that about anything, I can tell you. And I've been in the Labour Party since 1959. Yeah, well, as a member, I was 11 years in Westminster. But does that answer your question? It's just not the case that they're totally united on this.
I'm going to ask Tessa a question, if I may. You actually came forward with some very positive goals and aspirations. Is there any reason why these goals and aspirations can't be met under the present political settlement of devolution?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I thought that would come up, because why haven't things been better since devolution? You could well say they should have been. I think that in the early years we had a different cultural minister every year. Then we closed down the Arts Council. Then we had several years trying to decide what to do next. Then we set up Creative Scotland, and that went haywire. So we've had a lot of administrative chaos since devolution with regards to culture. And that's not really surprising when you think that we've always taken our orders from the south before, and we weren't organised at deciding what we wanted ourselves. But it is shameful, and I think that one of the things that has to happen is a change of attitude. I don't think the smoking ban would have worked if it hadn't given us permission to change our attitude towards smoking. And I think independence will give us permission to change our attitude towards our own culture and to take pride in it. As Maria says, it isn't a vote about this or that party taking over the next few years of government. It's a vote to have the choice ourselves to elect our own government. And that may well be a government that follows the Jimmy Reid Foundation's ideas for the common weal, which are very positive, to have a more egalitarian society, to do more for women and children, which I feel very strongly about. Definitely to have free education, that's an absolute, utter must, especially if we're to continue in our tradition of the democratic intellect, which Andrew was setting out, which arose during the Enlightenment, when philosophers and scientists and writers and people from different disciplines could speak to one another and come to views on life together in a dialogue. So I think all those things are important, and that we have this wonderful opportunity, as Andrew said, to take our chance, as Montrose said.
But Andrew, was the union not a precondition for the Scottish Enlightenment? And could you not argue then that if there is to be a new Enlightenment, continued union is equally a precondition?
We have the whole world to relate to, not just we have lots of interesting people in Europe and in other countries. We don't have to relate to London all the time.
I don't think the Act of Union was actually... fine. I don't think the Act of Union was a necessary condition. Was a necessary condition for the Enlightenment. But I think obviously, because initially the effect of the Act of Union was to transfer obviously Parliament down south, power down south, and in fact initially the impact of taxation and so forth was such that actually Scotland suffered. So for the first 15, 20, 30 years the economy suffered under the Union. It was only actually later on that, if you like, the resilience of the Scottish, the merchants particularly from Glasgow, created a much more prosperous society. So I don't actually think necessarily the Act of Union was a necessary condition for the Enlightenment. Just picking up the point that was being made, as a spectator, I think Scotland's done a lot of things which are different actually. We see Scotland is very much moving towards what I would talk of being a Scandinavian type of democracy, a fairly caring democracy which is inclusive, whereas increasingly at the moment under our current government down south, I think it is a fairly divisive government. We find it very, very divisive in the actions that they take. There is a very sort of strong elite. Funny enough, Lord Kames, Enlightenment, he actually does say actually that the pupils, the students at Eton, Winchester and Westminster are taught how to take, not how to give. And it's quite amazing. I saw that quote a while back, and I just think it's quite amazing that all those years ago there was this, even then there was this feeling of a clique of public schools which run the country. But you've done lots of things. You've got education. I mean, free education, free university education. It's going to be a hell of a problem if you get independence, because every EU country, which will also include England, will be able to send its students free of charge to be educated. So you have to think that one through. But I personally think free education, free university education is absolutely the right thing to be doing, and it's absolutely in the lines of the Enlightenment. The one thing that really came out of me, out of reading about all these people, is youngsters. We have to give young people the best opportunity, the best education, the best help, the best encouragement to make the most they can of their lives. And I think you are doing that more than we are in England. And I think also that is really one of the things you need to judge by. What will give you your children and your grandchildren? What will give them the best opportunities? Is it independence, with Scotland running its own affairs? Is it being part of a larger Great Britain with all the bigger opportunities that might have? That's your decision. But I think I think Scotland is doing a lot of things which are different. I think, with every respect, there are changes.
Well,
looking again to the audience for another question. There's one at the back.
I'd like to add to that.
Please.
Right.
If you just wait.
Just a couple of points on free education. Yes, a great thing to have. I'm proud of the fact that we have it. But let's remind ourselves that in further education, the level of education that thousands and thousands of people need to get themselves into decent jobs, and especially in the case of women who might have a young family and then they're looking for a qualification that gets them into a decent job. Well, 80,000 FU places have been lost since the nationalist government took control. Now, I don't think that's acceptable. But why do we never hear about that in the papers that are supposedly pro-union? Because I think that's a disgrace. It really is appalling that they are left out in that way while we take pride in funding university education. And when the word Scandinavia was mentioned, I thought, here I come back to an argument that's very familiar to me, possibly to many of the audience. You can aspire to Scandinavian social services, but you can't have them on Irish taxes. And the present government of Scotland actually wants to reduce the tax paid by corporations to 3 points lower than even the Tory Chancellor wants to do. So that makes me wonder about just how moving in a social democratic direction there really would be if you have independence.
I would just say that...
No. I'm going to take the question at the back first, Craig.
I just really welcomed Andrew's suggestion that we need conviction in the debate. I thought that was a really well-made point, and I think all of the panellists have spoken beautifully about their conviction and their views. But I wanted to ask them to kind of encourage us to look at others, and I wondered, who was it who's inspired you, whose writings and whose words has inspired you, and who would you recommend us to look at in relation to making our decisions on the 18th of September?
Can I come to you first, Craig?
I've got a stack of books beside my chair at home that I would say, if you haven't read Ian McWhirter's Road to Referendum, that gives you the full story right back from the Act of Union, before the Act of Union, right up to where we're at now. Takes the historical context, political context, brings in elements of, you know, the fact that Scottish history wasn't taught in Scottish schools for years. If you're not a yes voter by the time you've read that, you need to start again and read it again. And it's actually fairly impartially written. I don't even think Ian McWhirter is particularly pro-yes. I think he favours a more federal solution, but it's an eye-opener. That's a good one. There's also excellent books on your own publishers, Louth Press, Arguing for Independence, but there's one called The Independence Book that is a wee series of small essays and lectures that was good as well. This is all non-fiction though, obviously. I've got a fiction book about it if you want. It's very easy, quite a light read.
But since you've mentioned fiction, Scotland's favourite novel, because Scottish Book Trust did a poll, is Sunset Song. And yet Sunset Song is a novel, particularly if you look at the trilogy of which it's part, which is avowedly socialist rather than nationalist in its intent. It looks for socialist solidarity rather than national unity. So is there a contradiction here between the favourite book of Scots and, as it were, the message or the movement of that book?
I don't know. I mean, I think we're a more socialist country. I mean, I think the SNP currently they're more left-wing party than Labour are. And I haven't read any loose Grasset Gibbons in school, so it's been a while. But I mean, stuff like And the Land Lay Still, James Robertson, that's an excellent book that kind of looks at the situation we're in over a long period of time as well. But I don't know.
Tessa, is there a novel or a poet to...
There's Stephen Maxwell's book and there's Leslie Riddick's book, and Leslie Riddick makes the point that we have this learn to fail phenomenon in Scotland, when we're happier with just chugging along and failing than trying again and being knocked back, and I think that's very true. Yes, James Robertson's novels I would recommend, definitely. I'm not a detective novel reader, I'm afraid. I mostly read biographies and histories. But I would like to make the point about the environment, which we haven't quite mentioned yet. Craig mentioned Trident. If we get rid of Trident and encourage renewable energy, and it may be that we'll get a green government. We can have a government we choose. It's not a question of what the SNP would do or what Labour would do. We will choose the government we want, and we will tell them what we want them to do. It will be power to the people, and that's what we want.
But can I come back to a disconnect here? You aspire towards a more vibrant, more dynamic Scottish culture particularly a culture of the written word, because that's how Scotland has made its reputation externally. How will the removal of one Trident missile, how is, you know, what are the preconditions for such a vibrant, dynamic culture? And surely it's not taking away Trident or any of the other things that have been mentioned in political terms.
Well, I don't know where else we get the well-funded publishers. We've got to get the money for the publishers, we've got to get money for writers to survive. I've never made a penny from my work, ever. And I've published 20 books of poetry. That is not a good sign. There's no way that writers can really earn their living. There's so much we've got to work on to make things better for creative people generally, rather than simply bankers.
I think Trident, getting rid of Trident is going to save us, Trident replacement is going to save us 250 billion a year. That would teach 4,500 teachers. Teachers. That would train 4,500 teachers or build 20 primary schools. So
I'm going to let Maria in first, then Andrew.
Please, Maria.
A couple of points. First of all, on Trident, if you read the white paper, you're not getting rid of it anytime soon. They use language like, we aspire to, we shall, you know, we shall carry this out in the future, but they don't set a date by which it will go. And more to the point than that, already it's been said by the nationalists that they want to keep in NATO. They are happy to have NATO ships visiting Scottish ports, which may or may not be carrying nuclear weapons, on a don't ask, don't tell basis. And Alex Salmond has even gone so far as to say he would like American bases to be in this country. Now, that's something. I have been anti-nuclear all my life, but I certainly don't think these are acceptable conditions. And why is he talking about an American basis in Scotland, as if American digging into our affairs was somehow more acceptable than England if it was doing so? You know, I think these questions need to be answered by people who think, oh, we're going to get rid of Trident, because there's other ways in which it's highly unsatisfactory.
Can I ask you a question, Maria? Why do you think so many representatives of Scottish culture, musicians, artists, etc., are in the yes camp? Is there a reason for that?
Well, I think there are two reasons occurred to me at once. One is that if they are focused on Scotland as their subject matter in one way or another, then of course they're likely to be voting yes if that's the range of their focus. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but if that's their range, that's likely to be that way. But I think also something else is going on, because I have heard of instances in not so much in writing, but in areas like playwriting and theatre, that they feel that they have to say they're saying yes because they feel they are under pressure from this government. If they come out openly, yes, I'm sorry, it's true. It is absolutely true. I could quote you chapter and verse, but I don't have the time right now to go into it all. But I'm sorry, but that is true. There are people who are not getting funding because they have annoyed the present government. It happens.
There's a lady anxious to get in.
That's quite a different question, because we seem to be going very political. Why is place, do you think, so important to us? Why is it? Apparently it's a human right to be allowed to live in the place that you're born and you live in. It's a war crime to displace people. We know what's happening in the world in Crimea and Ukraine. Place is vital. It's who we are. Why is that, do you think? You were talking about earlier, Tessa, about it being part of our psyche. Yeah. Why do you think that is? I mean, it's only land, it's trees, why is it so important?
Can I pass that question to Andrew, because as I mentioned earlier, he's an exile in Surrey. An exile.
An exile. Personally, I was going to say, I think the debate sort of switched into Trident. And I think that, again, is the negative part. What you're trying to create, surely, is aspirations. It's not actually the personally, I would tend to be sympathetic to get away with Trident, but that's a decision for the Scottish people in an independent country. But surely that is not...
Why is it so important? That's why,
but
because it gives us confidence as a people.
Exactly. What I think independence would only work if it unleashes a confident Scottish people.
It will. It gives
And you
us
have
permission.
to believe, if you want to vote for independence, you have to believe that you can actually create a better, fairer, possibly more prosperous, greener society than you will as part of Britain. If you don't believe that, then don't vote for independence. But I think that is the fundamental decision I think you have to make. You have to raise your vision a wee bit above the parapets, as they say.
I would say sense of place. I mean, what does it say about our sense of place if we allow Trident on our soil 30 miles outside our biggest city? You know, we can't have a lot of pride for our country if we allow Trident to be housed there. If we get rid of Trident, I think the cultural, we'll fill that cultural void with independence. I think our sense of our own identity and our own place will, as Leslie Riddick's book says, it will blossom. I think our sense of self and place will grow because we'll fill that void that we've got at the moment where we've got this kind of sense that we want to do better and we want to do more and we want to achieve more, but we can't do it because we're kind of shackled to Westminster decisions. We only get to play with the powers that they let us play with. So independence will fill that gap and allow Scottish culture, Scottish sense of identity and place to grow. I think.
There was a lady in the front row with a question. If you just wait for the microphone.
Oh, right. Thank you. I was born in, funnily enough, Liverpool, as Maria was mentioning. One of my most treasured possessions is my grandfather's copy of the Ragged Trousers of the Philanthropist. He was a trade unionist. I was very active in the Labour Party for many years. I was a CLP chair. And I'm wondering if Maria is aware of just how many former Labour Party members in Scotland are absolutely horrified at the Labour Party ganging up with the other unionist parties, and that many of us have followed a similar journey towards the yes vote. And is she also aware that, in fact, there's actually quite a strong constituency of socialists and Labour Party supporters and so forth in the north of England who actually wish us well and wish that they too could free themselves of the Tory yoke, and perhaps it would be more appropriate if, I really don't personally want to wake up the day after the next general election and realise that, we had an opportunity not to be subject to the next round of appalling cuts and so forth, and we didn't take it.
Yes.
First of all, the idea of the three party spokespersons ganging up on Scotland. If you examine what they actually said, each one was saying that there was a simple factual matter that they all agreed on, because it wasn't a matter of opinion, it's a fact that there is great difficulty in organising a system where you can share a currency, but they're going in two different directions. It doesn't happen. If you look at the state of Greece just now in the European Union, you see the point of what I'm making. That's an extreme example, but that's the kind of thing that you have to take account of when you're sharing a currency. Someone here mentioned that if it wouldn't necessarily be a nationalist government that got elected, but I think they're very likely to be the first government, but that's not really my objection, because I'm talking about hundreds of years to come, and who knows what will develop over those hundreds of years. But if you're hoping to have a socialist or green government, I'm afraid the facts are against you there as well, because no far-left small party has managed to get anyone elected to the Scottish Parliament or Westminster since Tommy Sheridan's downfall. That's the reality. People are not willing to support those small groups. They may be sometime in the future, but it's certainly not happening now.
Things can change, that's the whole point. Things can change.
But if you look 100 years ahead, Tessa, is there a risk that in an independent Scotland, Scottish culture will become insular, inward-looking?
No, not at all. Not at all. We look out from Scotland to the whole world. We've got links with the whole world, and we can develop those links and enjoy them, and they can flourish.
Lady, second row first.
I just wanted to thank everybody. But also to pick up on the questions that were asked at the beginning, where Andrew, in a way, was being challenged that you say that we're just doing bean counting, and because that's what the newspapers are shouting at us. I just wondered, Chair, if it would be possible to have a show of hands of how many people are going to make their decision on the basis of beans, and how many are wanting to make their decision on their passion. Whatever their decision is going to be, yes or no, is it because of the beans, or is it because of something deeper and more fundamental?
Okay, so regardless of whether you're voting yes or no, is the motive behind your decision economic? Put your hands up.
It's probably have a hand up for both.
Right. Okay, if you put your hands down, and if you're...
it's a pointless exercise. These things are interfused.
You can't separate them. Okay. Is that the answer to your question, that people are unwilling to... They're taking a holistic view rather than determining it by whether they're £500 better off or whether, as it were, they have aspirations for their grandchildren? Right. There was a question, lady in the green.
Hiya, I'm a student and a young person in Scotland, and as you're obviously aware, the student involvement in this has been quite strong. But my peers have obviously not been influenced by the same things that, if I may say, a lot of people in this room will have been influenced by, because we've not lived through things like the Thatcher era, for example. So I was just wondering if you felt that anything in your lifetime had really influenced your opinion, either for independence or against it, that you felt that people my age hadn't had a chance to experience.
Can I split that up into two questions to all of you? One is to ask whether there is something in your lifetime that's influenced your point of view, but ask you, what do you think might influence particularly 16 and 17-year-olds who have the vote for the first time? Craig?
Well, I think my politics were shaped growing up in the central belt of Scotland in the 1980s, where I remember my parents in 1979 in the devolution referendum, and we voted yes, but we didn't get it because of the 40% rule, which is widely known, a Labour amendment at the last minute. But we were promised, you know, if we voted no, there'd be more powers, more devolution. The same thing they're doing now with Labour's devolution light, that even Joanne Lamont doesn't even seem to understand. The problem with devolution is Holyrood is built on a rug, and they can pull that away at any point with devolution. They can remove any powers at any point, like they did with energy recently in a House of Lords vote. These are the things that say to me, it's independence we need. But what shaped me after the devolution vote in the 80s, in 1979 was in the 80s, my parents both worked in British Leyland, so they were both made unemployed at the same time, so we suffered hardship. I grew up in a housing scheme where everybody's parents were unemployed at the same time. 2 years later, Polkemmet Pit closed, which was just up around the corner. So we went from a vibrant community where everybody's parents knew each other. The town slowly declined over the years. It's now a fairly depressing place, if I'm honest. You know, it's the same as every small town in Scotland. It's a parade of charity shops and cash centres and pound stretchers and all the rest of it. And there's no way, we can't go on like this, you know. We can do better than this, and we know we're wealthy enough to do it.
And do you think there's anything that would influence 16 and 17-year-olds
well, 16,
comparable to your experience?
They've grown up under the benefits of a devolved Scottish government, so maybe they've been saved a lot of the hardship that we saw, people that were growing up in the 70s and 80s. But it is true that they're not engaged. I was sitting on the train from Musselburgh tonight, and there was a crowd they got on. They'd come from Queen Margaret University, which kind of makes me worry what they're teaching them up there. Because they sat very loudly saying, one of them, the loudest of the lot, was saying, you know, this vote in September isn't a vote for independence, it's a vote on whether we want to vote for independence. Just voting to say, if we vote yes, it just means we're going to have a referendum. And I was sitting there thinking, what the hell are you on about? And then he started saying, an oil, anyway, it's not our oil, it's out in the sea, anybody can claim that oil. Anybody can have that oil. And they had the usual obsession with Alex Salmond that everybody who is confused about the issue does have. It's all SNP and Salmond. I voted SNP in 2011 in Scotland. because I was fed up of voting Labour and getting nothing. But I wouldn't say I was an SNP voter. I'm hoping that a Labour Party, you know, there's no such party as Scottish Labour, they don't exist. There is only UK Labour, there's a Scottish branch. So they're just working for their paymasters down south, unfortunately. But I wish, and I know there are good people in the Labour Party, and there has been good people in the Labour Party, and I hope that they would come back and resurface. And if there was a genuine Scottish Labour Party surfaced prior to this referendum and backed independence, it would be a landslide, because we'd corner all the Labour on the right.
Tessa, is there one experience or event in your life that has led you to your present perspective?
Well, I came to Scotland when I was 10 years old from India. I was born in the British Raj. But Scotland is my home, and when I started working for the Scottish Poetry Library, I realised the situation. It was very, very dire in the early 80s. I could give you a whole reel of facts, like MacDermid was out of print, Souter was out of print, the Oxford Book of Scottish Verse was out of print, the Penguin Book of Scottish Verse was out of print. You didn't get your book in the shops or in the libraries unless you were published by Faber or Chatto or Penguin. In fact, Douglas Dunn was on radio with me in the mid-80s, and he said it would be literary suicide to be published in Scotland. That was the attitude. And that attitude has changed a little bit. This is what I'm trying to say. It's the attitudes that have to change. And independence will give us permission to just look at things differently, take the blinkers off that we've had on for so long, regarding ourselves as second-rate and apologising and wanting to get a pat on the back from down south. We don't need that. So I do, yes, that's really behind it. But Douglas Dunn is published in Scotland now. Things have changed. However, we still have to, as far as the young people are concerned, I have 8 grandchildren. The eldest is 28, the youngest is 8. They're all voting yes, as it were. Not the ones that are old enough to vote, of course, but the ones that aren't old enough to vote are still voting yes. Two of them are learning Gaelic, but the only ones that are a bit dubious are the ones that have been 6 years educated in France. And they are very international and so on, and they don't quite understand. And the trouble is that since they came back to Scotland, they've been at school in Scotland, they've been at university in Scotland, they've learnt nothing about our politics or our history or our literature. Whereas when they were educated in France, they learnt everything about France. Yes.
Well, Andrew, was it your research into the Scottish Enlightenment that has influenced your perspective?
Well, I sort of have said I haven't got a perspective, and I'm going to try and stick to that story. I think one thing that I find very motivating is somebody, and I can't remember who, many years ago said that Britain had lost an empire but hadn't found a role. I don't think Britain has learnt it's lost an empire yet, and I think the things that I have found very difficult in recent years were things like the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan. We now are getting, Crimea, we're sort of throwing our weight about saying we're going to have these sanctions and everything else. And I think Britain has got to learn that it is not actually a world power anymore, and it must learn to adjust to that. And I think an independent Scotland would actually be a much more rational player in the world than Britain with its delusions of empire which still exist.
Maria, the last word to you.
Right, where do I begin? I agree with you that Britain is no longer a world force in the sense that it was when it had the British Empire. That's pretty obvious. But things change over the years. We have lost a lot of the former empire because people broke away because they were oppressed. And I cannot for a minute believe that Scotland is oppressed in the way that colonial countries were, under the boot of another country, exploiting their natural resources, exploiting their people. You asked me what influenced me. I'm quite clear about that. When I was a child living in Glasgow, and I still remember it, when the National Health Service came into being, and my parents got their dentistry and their spectacles that they couldn't afford before. And I have always thought that the creation of that welfare state was a great achievement delivered by Westminster, The Prime Minister was an Englishman, and the creator of the health service was Welsh. So I have never had any sense that we are uniquely superior in our own way. I think we clearly have great qualities that have been touched on, but I don't think we are, as a whole nation, superior. And that whole nation keeps changing all the time. There are now people living in Scotland who'd been regarded as totally unacceptable 100 years ago and more. But heavens, 100 years ago, Scotland was complaining about Irish people coming over, never mind anyone else. So that's what has strong influence me. And as for 16 and 17-year-olds, I see them worrying about the opportunity to go and work wherever they please, because they might find a perfect job for them in Scotland, but they fear that there could be a closing of doors elsewhere in the United Kingdom if we became a foreign country. And that's bothering them, and also about widening their educational opportunities. We can't assume that any possible benefit in education could only be delivered in Scotland. I mean, nobody believes that anywhere in the world, that their own country is the only place where they can get the best of education.
I'm afraid time has caught up with us, but just before we go, could I ask if you're willing to show us the composition of the audience now at the end? Those who think they're going to vote yes, would you raise your hands? Okay, those who think they're going to vote no, could you raise your hands? And those who are still undecided? Okay, you're obviously not a representative audience sense, but it's interesting to know the composition. Well, can I thank you all for...
Isn't the ballot box in this country secret? So why are you asking people to make a...
I asked if you, I did put in a conditional if you wish to let us know. But can I thank you all for doing that, and can I thank you all for coming? Can I thank the library again and Annie Bell for her able and efficient organisation of the event? And can I